Dan Brumberg is actually a very good friend of our Center for Middle East Studies. I was trying to think how many times we've hosted him here, and I think the number is at least 3, perhaps 4. And that's just another way of saying that we deeply value his insights, the depth of his analysis that he brings to the study of Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. Now, Dan and I don't always agree on things, but even when we do disagree, I always find his arguments, valuable, worthy of consideration, and it's wonderful to have him here. He's actually one of the few Middle East scholars who actually studies and has an in-depth grasp of the politics of the Arab world and of Iran. Usually Middle East scholars do one or the other. Dan does both, and he is a leading, scholar of democratic transitions and political authoritarianism in the Arab world. I recall distinctly when I was a PhD student, I read this article called "The Trap of Liberalized Autocracy" that really left an impression on me, and I remembered the name Dan Brumberg because he was the author of that particular piece, and I've used it in my intro to Middle East politics courses over the years. Officially, Dan's title is that of Director of Democracy and Governance Studies at Georgetown University. They have an MA program similar to ours, which means he's one of our competitors, but it's healthy competition when it comes to students pursuing master's degrees at prestigious American institutions. He also writes a regular blog on contemporary issues in the Middle East for the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. that I highly recommend. Prior to going to Georgetown, he was at Emory University. He was a fellow in the Middle East program at the Carter Center. And of course, he's here to talk about a very important sort of set of developments in the Middle East that has brought us to the brink of war. In late June, you might recall, Donald Trump had given the order to militarily strike back at the Islamic Republic of Iran after they shot down a drone that Iran claimed veered into Iranian airspace. Trump said the planes were in the air, and at the last moment he pulled back. About 3 weeks ago, as you all know, there was a very famous and catastrophic attack on the Saudi oil facilities that most people believe the Islamic Republic of Iran was responsible for, either directly or indirectly. And so that is the second moment where we've been on the precipice of war. And if you're following the diplomatic negotiations over U.S.-Iran relations, it seems like the French proposal that was bandied about and on the table a few weeks ago at the United Nations, it seems like that ship has sailed, and so we are in uncharted waters. It's uncertain what will happen next. We have at least more than a year left until the next presidential election. So to help us navigate this particular terrain, to interpret what's happening, to perhaps share with us what the prospects for peace are and what the chances or probability of war is between the United States and Iran, we have, in my view, one of the best experts on the topic, Daniel Brumberg. Please join me in welcoming him to the Korbel School.
Well, what Nada didn't mention was that my wife is from Denver, and I'm staying with my father-in-law here. And in addition to having me out here to talk, he's facilitated family values by making it possible for us to come together. Now, this time it did not come with my wife and son. I'm here alone in terms of the family, but coming back to Denver is coming back home. I've been coming here for 20 plus years, and it's a city that I love, and one of my dearest friends that I grew up with, Frank Schuckert, who sadly passed away suddenly from a heart attack, was a prominent lawyer here, and I might add a stand-up comic here in Denver. But getting to the substance of my talk as opposed to the family and friends, I'm delighted to be back here, and I think I know what the Iranians are up to. I think I understand that. I live in Washington, D.C. I was born and raised in Washington. My late father worked for the State Department on Soviet politics, as it used to be called in those days. And I think I understand the city. At least I think I used to understand the city. I understand Iran, but I don't understand the Trump administration. I don't know if you share this sentiment with me at all. But I think that a lot of what we're dealing with now in terms of what we're dealing with now in terms of the possibility or prospects for a wider conflict originate in the decision of the United States to essentially walk away from, and this was Trump's decision, the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, an agreement that was far from perfect, but would have created a context for dealing not only with the nuclear deal, but other matters pertaining to the U.S.-Iran relationship, including the whole question of the Iranian missile system, which was not part of the original agreement, but could have been addressed. And Trump, in essentially scrapping that, he said it was a terrible agreement, but I'm quite sure he didn't read it. I don't even think he read a summary of it. I'm serious. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, what we're dealing with now is, in terms of foreign policy, my own sense is that Trump's domestic and foreign policy is basically predicated on rejecting anything that Obama did. I think this is, I mean, a strange basis for a domestic and foreign, but largely based on a deeply seated anger and resentment towards the previous president. And based on that, we're going to scrap this agreement. But once we scrap this agreement, the whole framework for dealing with Iran was cast aside. And we're back to a U.S.-Iran strategy that isn't a strategy. It's just based on momentary tactics. There isn't a coherent vision of where we want to go. And when we jettisoned that agreement, there was no sense of what the implications were. There was a sense coming from certain elements linked to the White House, including Bolton, who has since left NSC, that we would replace a diplomatic strategy with a regime change strategy. And in effect, when the United States reimposed sanctions on Iran, it essentially declared economic war against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, this is an authoritarian regime. It's a very repressive regime. It's not a pretty regime. I'm not making any excuses for that. But whatever country we're talking about, when its lifeline is oil, and that is the lifeline of the Islamic Republic of Iran, when your lifeline is oil, effectively you're facing a country that is the United States that has declared war. And this is something that we don't see in Washington. It's not a point that's often made. Recently, Karim Sajapur, who is at Carnegie, a colleague and friend, had a piece in Time magazine called Iran's War. But it just was published today, I believe. But it's not Iran's war, it's our war, in the sense that we decided basically to declare a form of war. And the dirty little secret in terms of Iran's ambitions for nuclear power is that Iran cannot sustain its economy with nuclear power. And Iran really cannot sustain its defense through the acquisition of nuclear weapons. And this is something the Iranians sort of realized when they signed the agreement. Because what is critical to regime survival in Iran is oil. The distribution of oil, the rent through all kinds of institutions is what sustains this regime. And once you cut that off, you cut off the regime. Of course, you don't cut off the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, because their power is in some sense enhanced by sanctions. They control so much of the smuggling, so many of the means, so they can instrumentalize this to their favor. But they do so against the perception that the U.S. is essentially trying to bring down the regime. So a strategy of regime change is what really was inaugurated, if you call this a strategy. And I think we're living now with the results of that. That's basically the point I wish to get across. I'm not in any way making excuses for Iran's actions in the Gulf, for Iran's attack on the Saudis, which we'll talk about, Saudi oil facilities, which was really unprecedented, obviously. And I do think that this was, the Iranians were essentially behind this attack. Houthi forces, whatever, it's impossible to envision this as not taking place without Iranian support. Iranian activity in Lebanon recently. I'm not making excuses for any of that. But what I think we have to understand was, from the vantage point of particularly President Rouhani and Zarif, they had staked their entire political career on the assumption that they would get this agreement with the United States. And in that context, there would be a de-escalation of U.S.-Iran conflict. And there might be other avenues for exploring other kinds of agreements. And the reason why Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, were eager to have that agreement was not only that it lends itself to a de-escalation of conflict, but they were eager to restart oil sales in a way that would allow Iran's economy to come back. and they were eager to create a context in which there would be some meaningful prospects of reopening the Iranian political arena. I'm not using the word democracy, that's far too ambitious, but I am talking about some sort of liberalization of the Iranian political arena. So much of their project was really based on getting this sort of agreement, and Trump pulled out the rug from all of this, essentially, when he chose to make that decision without really thinking through the full strategic implications. You know, regime change is not a strategy, it's an aspiration. My late father had two axioms, one of which was never predict something until after it happens, which I always thought was very wise. Predictions are dangerous, and I'm not going to make a prediction probably today. But the other one was, you know, this is from Eastern Europe. If grandma had wheels, she'd be a wheelbarrow, which I suppose in Yiddish sounded probably more authentic at the time. But you know, this is if we could have a policy of regime change and it happened in ways that we would like it, this would be wonderful. I mean, why not? But if we want actually to talk about the possibilities for real prospects for change in Iran, we're talking about a longer process of liberalization that has to take place in the context of a de-escalation of U.S.-Iran relations. Can one imagine the possibility of a Gorbachev in the context of a U.S. decision to make war on the Soviet Union, of course, which was not fathomable at that point. But just think about the implications. So this was really what we're living with here since we made that decision. And we've been at various chapters in the sort of the outcome of this. And one thing that strikes me about the current situation that we've seen over the last few weeks is that none of the players want war. Khamenei, the supreme leader, doesn't want a war. Clearly, our president doesn't want a war. He pulled the planes back 10 minutes before they were supposed to strike, or 15 minutes before they were, according to the story. I don't think the IRGC wants a war, but we could have one because nobody has thought through on this side of the ocean in particular how we're going to manage this relationship without a diplomatic arena and structure to do so, and in the context of a policy which is basically a regime change. And that, you know, that as much as Trump has backed away from that policy verbally, and even in the context of firing or retiring NSC Chair Bolton, we still don't have a clear sense of what we're doing in terms of an approach other than regime change. And we refuse to talk about taking away the reimposed sanctions as a basis for talking with the Iranians. Yet we've had these different moments that Nader just referred to in his introduction. And I just want to quote how the kind of up and down of this relationship from two pieces that I recently wrote, one of which happened in August when, of course, Zarif came to the G7 meeting or G6 meeting and started talking about wanting to get a process going. And at this point, he said, after arriving for the meeting, he said, Iran's active pursuit of constructive engagement continues, even if the road is difficult. And then Rouhani chimed in, and he supported that statement, although he was then cut off by the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, which really tried to corral Rouhani. But Rouhani supported his foreign minister. But the interesting thing about Rouhani's statement, it was then followed by a statement from our president, who said on August 26, we're not looking for leadership change. We're not looking for leadership change. In other words, the president got up and renounced regime change, which is, who decided that? When did that happen? Who knows? Because that's what he decided to do at that particular moment. There is no strategic foundation to anything that is being said in this regard on this, or much less any foreign policy. So at that point, our president says, we're not looking, okay, sudden change. I mean, it seemed to be pretty significant. We're looking for no nuclear weapons, okay, which is the point of the original agreement that he cast aside. All right, putting no ballistic missiles, which was not part of the original agreement, but could have been discussed, and a longer period of time for any sort of agreement, and what we refer to in the business as the sunset clause. And then he said, to end the sentence, very simple. Not so simple. Not so simple. But that was the three elements. And then, of course, we had the September 14th missile. So there was all this talk of talk, and we were going to have negotiations, and all this stuff was going to happen. And then there was this extraordinary attack on September 14th, unprecedented. And Trump responds the day after this, there is reason to believe, this is a tweet, of course, because we now conduct tweet diplomacy. We know the culprit, which is Iran. This is Trump tweeting, but are waiting to hear from the kingdom as to who they believe was the cause and under what terms we should proceed. Well, you can imagine the response on the Hill, including the Republican Party, which is, we're waiting for the Saudis to tell us what to do, which is exactly what Trump was saying. So now we're waiting for the Saudis to tell us what to do in response, because, of course, Trump does not want to go to war. But he doesn't have an answer to how, and the possibility, obviously, in the wake of this attack for some meaningful negotiations has been greatly reduced. There's still the upcoming UN General Assembly meetings, the talk of Rouhani and so on, but under these circumstances, there is very little chance of this, and precisely as was said, the prospects for some sort of conflict are increasing. So what's going on? My sense is this. In the wake of the decision of the United States to back away from the agreement and to reimpose sanctions and to effectively declare war on Iran, economic war, the Iranians have engaged in what I would call a policy of controlled escalation. You can see the policy unfolding in Lebanon. You can see the policy unfolding in Syria and Iraq, obviously in the Gulf and in the attacks on the tankers. And the idea basically is to signal that, if we can't buy oil, nobody's going to buy oil. And this is going to be a very dangerous area. And we're going to push and push and push. And in pushing, we're going to get one of two outcomes. And I think this is what Zarif was hoping for. We're either going to get the Europeans and the French to come in there with an agreement by which we can bypass the sanctions and continue to do what we always wanted to do, which is buy oil, please, sell oil, please. And we'll either get that because the Europeans are going to go berserk, seeing the possibility of a full-scale war, and the Iranians are pushing and pushing, of course, with a great risk that if they push too far, the Europeans will turn around and say, well, that's unacceptable. And perhaps in the hope that by pushing in a strategy of controlled escalation, they are going to get the attention of people in the U.S. administration who want to talk, including perhaps our president himself. And so we see one manifestation of this along the Israeli-Lebanese front, in which the Israelis attack Iranian or Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. And it's almost as if there was an agreement. I'll do this and you'll do this, right? The Israelis attack, the Hezbollah forces respond, but in a very limited way. Clearly sending a signal, but not trying to go past a certain red line. So a policy of controlled escalation has red lines for this to work. If we can't control it, it's by definition not successful, right? But by definition, a policy of controlled escalation is going to raise the prospects that at some point or other, you're going to do something that the other side will simply see as unacceptable. Bibi Netanyahu does not want to go to a war with Hezbollah. They have an amazing capacity to respond and send a lot of very sophisticated missiles Israel's way. They can go way past Tel Aviv if they choose to do so. So Bibi doesn't want a war. Hezbollah knows the consequences of a war for Lebanon. The Israelis have made it very clear. Trump doesn't want a war. Khamenei, the supreme leader, and they don't call him the supreme leader for nothing, right? I mean, he's the ultimate guy, right? Doesn't want a war. What does the Islamic Revolutionary Guard want? Well, this is sort of the difficult question. They can't step too far beyond what the supreme leader wants. That's a risky strategy. But then we had this attack on September 14th, which was first reported as a drone attack, right? And then it was reported as a missile attack, a much more sophisticated missile attack, the likes of which probably could not come from the Houthis. And it's pretty clear that the Iranian fingerprints are all over this thing, and that they have taken a step far beyond and perhaps across the very kind of red line, which was critical to maintaining for this sort of strategy to have an impact. So what's going on? We were just talking about this because we're geniuses. We know everything, or clearly nearly everything, but we can't figure out what the heck is going on. So if I could get up here and give you a clear answer, I would, and I can't. Because I would expect that this kind of attack on an oil facility would be something that would trigger, the Iranians would perceive this as triggering a response from Trump of the very nature that they don't want to see. And so why engage in this sort of risky behavior? It's really going in a far more escalatory pattern than they ever did before. And I find it hard to imagine that the Supreme Leader would do so, that the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, this very powerful military and political force, would do so without getting some sort of green light from the leader. Maybe so, but it's just hard to imagine because he is the ultimate source of authority, and you don't go running around doing things that could make life difficult for him. So perhaps he did give it a green light. But what it really meant was that they were, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, was pushing for a strategy maybe they didn't see ultimately. For Zarif and Rouhani, controlled escalation is a strategy that is meant to bring diplomacy back. I mean, they are not, this is not an effort, you know, this notion of Iran going to war, the kind of the dominant discourse in Washington is, I think, just misleading, intentionally so. Because this is not Iran, this is not part of a project of regional expansion that the Iranians have been cooking up and executing the last 6 months. This is a response to what they perceive as a war on Iran. And so you would expect them to try to find ways to respond that would bring back the prospect of diplomacy. That is Zarif and Rouhani's project. But Zarif's power and influence over Iranian foreign policy has been diminishing precipitously for a few years now. And he certainly doesn't control most of the portfolios. Certainly the Syria portfolio is not controlled by Zarif. And one has to ask whether any portfolio is controlled by him anymore, given that this sort of attack that took place in Saudi Arabia. Therefore, maybe his view of what's going on is different from the IRGC, different from the Revolutionary Guard, because they don't want diplomacy. They have, from their perspective, they always argued, and they were supported by the Supreme Leader in this regard, that the U.S. would break the agreement. They said this was inevitable, and so yes, go ahead and sign the agreement, but they will break it. And then Trump said, yes, I'm going to write that script for you. I'm going to do precisely what you predicted. And so in the eyes of the leader and the IRGC and many Iranian leaders, they were right all along, and Zarif and Rouhani, and were wrong. And we have contributed to helping these hardline forces solidify their position and really sort of take over so much of the foreign policy apparatus. And so they could be trying to push for a level of conflict that would really throw any prospect of U.S.-Iranian talks. In other words, they're trying to act as spoilers. I mean, that's a possibility. Because from the point of view of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, U.S.-Iranian rapprochement is an existential threat to the very nature of the Islamic Republic. You cannot have an Islamic Republic that has normal relations with the United States. This is unacceptable. You can make various kinds of transactional agreements, but you can have rapprochement, to say it in French. It sounds so much more profound when you say it in French. You can't. And so maybe they were acting as spoilers. It's possible. I don't know. It certainly has brought us to a point where the nature of the kind of game has changed. The ground rules and red lines that we thought were prevailing are not there anymore. Our president does not desire to go into a full-scale war. And I want to be clear about one thing from my perspective, but also from the perspective of military leaders that I listen to, because I'm no military expert. The notion of an overnight attack on Iranian military facilities is a mirage. The Iranians have enormous capacity for retaliation. And that's why, as we know, and I've written about, it's the Pentagon that's been quietly lobbying against escalation. They do not want, because they do not think they can come out of this unharmed, right? We can't control it. The Iranians have so many ways to retaliate. In 2013, I testified on the Hill at a House Foreign Relations Committee, and sitting to my right, and that's kind of a euphemism, was Bolton. And Bolton kept saying, well, the Israelis should be bombing today, or should have started bombing 2 months ago. And my response was, we're not talking about an overnight attack. We're talking about something that will escalate into a full-scale war that could last months. And so I said, let's use words that have meaning and use the word war. And the committee just went quiet, as if I was saying something that was stunning. And I guess I was naive. At the time, I was working for the United States Institute of Peace and representing them there. And I think my colleagues sort of froze too, because it seems to be that kind of discourse, which I just thought was frank and real and realistic, was unacceptable. That you're not really supposed to talk about what the stakes are. But we now know what the stakes are. We're talking about a full-scale war. So nobody wants to go there. But nobody has an exit strategy from where we are now, because nobody has a strategy. And when I say nobody, particularly on our side, I think the Iranians, well, could they respond now if we said, the Iranian position is, and Zarif made this clear, that we are not going to talk as long as there are sanctions. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach, by the way, because they signed an agreement and kept to the agreement, and that's important to keep in mind. And this agreement required essentially removing nuclear-related sanctions in return for Iran's corralling its nuclear program. That was the deal. So when Rouhani and Zarif say we just want to go back, we don't want sanctions, they're going back to the premise of any negotiated deal. And so what we really have to do, and I'll conclude on this point, what we really have to do is decide what kind of deal we want, what kind of relationship do we want with Iran. Is it regime change? And is that what we're trying to achieve? And if so, we have to be ready to live with the consequences, which could be war. If we don't want regime change, then it has to be negotiation and an agreement. And an agreement means that both sides are happy and unhappy at the end of it. That's what an agreement is. Every time that Trump lists what he expects from the Iranians, including Pompeo's 12 famous conditions, which he has already said he's relinquished. I mean, it's so crazy. You don't know what's going on. But those are the 12 points that we insist they accept before negotiations. Now we say we've walked away from it. It's not a goal clear whether we're interested in diplomacy at all. Because diplomacy requires essentially accepting the premise that you are going to treat the other country as a country whose existence you accept as a fact, right? I mean, Israelis say the same thing to the Palestinians all the time. And the other way around, by the way, I might point that out. So we're not there. We still have a kind of de facto regime change strategy, and we have total chaos. The Iranians, meanwhile, pretty much have a sense of their strategic interests, where they want to go, but now they've pushed it to a point where even that assumption is questionable. And so we're really at a point now where it's very hard, to get back to my father's wise wisdom, to make any predictions until after the event. But I think we're in a very dangerous space where no one wants war, but the possibility for war cannot be excluded. So I'll leave it there and take your questions. Thank you.
Let me pose some questions.
Absolutely,
first,
absolutely.
You have a seat. Thank you, Dan, very much. I want to sort of, I guess, take advantage of this opportunity as sort of MC of this event to pose a couple of questions, maybe 3 points, and then we'll open it up to the audience. One of the things that's happening, Dan, that you didn't talk about that I think could have implications for the future of this particular issue is that one of the ways the Islamic Republic of Iran has responded to Trump's hardline policy is they're starting to reduce compliance with the terms of the Iran nuclear agreement. They're upping the nuclear enrichment. And Khamenei just gave a speech the other day saying we're going to continue to increase uranium enrichment heading toward 20%. This puts the Europeans in a very difficult position in terms of where they stand on this nuclear agreement. It looks like one likely scenario could be that they'll have to pull out if Iran is no longer adhering to the terms, and it seems like so. I mean, the question is, could you comment on this strategy that Iran is pursuing, which seems, yes, it's controlled escalation, but it's also high risk game. To continue to enrich uranium is immediately to just create a situation where your adversaries can just say, look, it's game over. We need to join the Americans in containing Iran over its nuclear program. So that's point number one. The second point that you didn't address, but I think it's relevant, is there's been a lot of talk over the last 2 or 3 weeks about this French proposal. What exactly has the French proposal been comprised of? What are the terms of it? Rouhani just the other day said that, look, it looks like a good framework for getting out of this. What's the sticking point? It seemed like, there was almost a chance to get to some sort of broad agreement at the United Nations. Then it fell apart. And now we're in this So what are the terms of the French agreement, and can that be revived in some way? And then the last point that, I think is really been unaddressed and unexamined, and you've hinted at it, but you haven't spoke, I think, with respect to the implications of this. And this has to do with the brazen attack on the Saudi oil facilities. Writing in the New York Times, I think last week, Robert Forth had the following observation to make, and I'd like you to comment on it. He says the missiles that struck last weekend in Saudi Arabia did not just destroy oil tanks. They also dealt the final blow to a doctrine that has been fading for years, the belief that the United States maintains a security umbrella able to protect the oil-rich Persian Gulf states from their enemies, and especially from Iran. It seems like this attack and the absence of an American response is telling us something about U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East, about the long-standing assumptions about the protection of that oil industry. In 1990, recall when Saddam Hussein was threatening those oil facilities, the United States led a global campaign to push him out of Kuwait. So could you perhaps reflect on the attack on the Saudi oil facilities and what it means for America's strategic interests in the region with respect to oil? I mean, this overlaps with a lot of things. There's an oil surplus in the world. The United States is no longer dependent on Middle East oil. To what extent is the United States' interest in the region now really shaped by oil interest or not? So those are three questions. I'll turn it back to you, and then we'll go to the audience.
Okay, great questions. Question two, I wish actually I don't have a lot of detail on this. We were just discussing it, but I'll try to answer as best as I can. But let me go with question one, which is really part and parcel of what I've been talking about, because faced by the U.S. position, the Iranians have to use whatever leverage they have to respond. So they engage in calculated escalation on the ground and in the air, right? And, of course, they decide to slowly but surely violate the agreement, which is completely predictable. I mean, are we shocked to find gambling in this particular casino? Answer no, because the Iranians are going to do, if the United States is not going to keep to the agreement, the Iranians are going to play the card, and we're not going to keep to the agreement. Of course, in the effort, very risky, to try to push the Europeans towards creating some sort of facility, that was another euphemism for it, for trade and for the export of Iranian and sale of Iranian oil. And so it's, I think it's misleading, by the way, to suggest that this is what the Iranians planned all along. They wanted an agreement that they would stick to for reasons that I've already explained. And again, here's the thing about a full-fledged nuclear weapons capacity. You don't get deterrence with one bomb. As a colleague of mine who's an expert on this put it in a series of meetings I held several years ago when I was still working with the USAP. I love the metaphor. You need a family of bombs because, in fact, you have to have a second strike capacity. You have to be able to demonstrate you can hit them back. And so one bomb is going to make you much more exposed. And getting from one to many, that's a really risky proposition. You have to up the ante in terms of your program way beyond what the Iranians actually had. You have to move to testing. That's, where are you going to test? How are you going to hide it? You have to, in other words, be able to do what the North Koreans did. And the Iranians realized that they can't do the North Korean model because there's this little problem called Israel. And if they move in this direction, they're in serious trouble because the Israelis do not want them to get one bomb or a family of bombs. The Israelis probably have that family of bombs already. And they probably putting some of them in submarines for obvious reasons because they're hard to detect, right? So if you want to have a serious nuclear weapons program, you have to go through a perilous route. The Iranians decided to cast that aside. What we don't really appreciate is the extent to which the agreement they signed was a crystal moment in the decision of the Iranians basically to walk away from a strategy which would have made them more insecure, not less. because they would have had to do a lot more to have a really credible program and to go the North Korean route. And so they decided against that. So now they're hinting at their readiness to do that by upping their enrichment. But it doesn't remove the peril of going in the direction that they decided to relinquish when they signed the agreement in 2015. So not only is it risky in terms of what the Europeans will do, which they say, you're violating the agreement, but let's say they continue along that path and they go back to where they were before. They still have to do a lot more to produce a program that's going to be really a comprehensive program, or even near one, that will have the kind of meaningful deterrence that they're looking for. And of course, the problem with deterrence is that the other side views it as an offensive weapon, not as a deterrent, right? So it's extremely risky. But again, it's very predictable. The Iranians are using whatever assets they can to try to create leverage, and it could backfire on them, literally, absolutely. But it's not unusual, and it's a response to our decisions, not some Iranian plan to create nuclear weapons, which is sometimes, that's what it's represented by in certain think tanks in Washington. Oh, this was going to happen anyway. No, the evidence doesn't suggest that at all. French proposal. So the euphemism of the word was a facility. Remember it all, and the reports were the Europeans, and this has been going on now for the last year. The Europeans and the Iranians would come up with a facility. It turned out that the facility was lacking in one crucial thing, to create a hard currency account to enable financial transactions that would bypass. And the interesting thing about the facility, this particular French agreement, was the United States seemed open to it. Trump and others alluded to accepting this in the good old days 4 weeks ago, whatever, 8 weeks ago it was, momentary good old days, right? And the reports that I just saw literally last night, we may have read the same report, was that this was moving forward. If the Iranians can get a program that really allows them to reestablish their capacity to sell oil and to re-energize their economy, this may be a way of getting them to pull back from the precipice that they have moved to. And I'm no expert on this, but from the little I've read about it is that even with the French proposal, there's just a lot of open questions about whether this is going to work and satisfy the Iranians and give them what they want. And so I don't remain optimistic about it, even though I understand the very serious consequences of this effort falling apart, which I think we all understand as well. And then the third question, which is really, it's like the $64 million question, and that is, what does it mean when Iran attacks a Saudi oil facility and the U.S. doesn't respond? Now, of course, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, thank you very much, and that was an extraordinary moment, and President Bush responded, I think, appropriately by essentially declaring this will not stand and pushing these forces out of there. It demonstrated it seemed to demonstrate the credibility of this doctrine, that we were not willing to accept that kind of outcome. But of course, we had enormous advantages in conducting that particular war. It was really a very quick rout of Saddam Hussein's troops, in a way that allowed us that made it possible for the concept and the execution to be closely aligned. We're not in that position anymore, given the implications of a full-scale war with Iran. And now suddenly we have this headache of what it means to really defend Saudi oil fields and what will be at stake. And that's precisely because what might be required, it would be a much more full-scale, sustained war that could have regional effects, the likes of which we didn't see with Saddam Hussein and the war in Kuwait, precisely because this is very unpredictable and very dangerous. We need diplomacy. So we're not put in this position where suddenly we're facing a decision that we would rather not. This notion of Iranian impunity, but what preceded Iranian impunity was American impunity. We created the conditions for this. So while I recognize that in some sense we have exposed the weakness of our own position in the region, I find it a little odd that sort of now suddenly there's all this talk about demonstrating U.S. credibility. When we created these conditions in which it became so difficult to demonstrate that credibility in the first place. The whole point of diplomacy was to make sure that we could reduce the gap, which is now yawning, between our stated goals and our capacities to a point where they were manageable by the fact of diplomacy. We no longer have this. So I think there is a question about us reestablishing U.S. credibility. I don't think the Saudis want U.S. going to war with Iran. I'm quite sure they don't. They've indicated as much already, which is a point that's really worth keeping in mind. They don't want the U.S. to engage in a full-scale war with Iran. I very much doubt that's what MBS wants. But if he doesn't want that, and we don't really want that, then the best way to affect the defense of our interests, including our oil interests, is through diplomacy and not putting us in a position where suddenly, by virtue of our own mistakes, we demonstrate the weakness and tensions in our own position, and effectively it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and our own deterrent capacity is undermined in ways that probably would have never had to happen in the first place. I mean, that's just how I see it.
Great. Question, Micheline, number 2, and I'll take, yes, number 3. Go ahead. Well, hold on, we have a microphone. Just give it a second so everyone can hear you.
Thanks for your talk. It was very enlightening. I want to know why we don't consider militarized economic sanctions as not an act of war when it affects the population, the civilians, as well as the military, and brings us closer to a military-type war.
Why we don't consider an act
Why we don't consider an act of war, why the world isn't more enraged by the fact that we're using our economics power to defeat a country, and cyber power too, I guess.
Well, I mean, that's you and I don't disagree on that. I mean, it seems to me that when you decide to essentially cut off Iran's oil exports and create an economic situation, by the way, which is not simply created by that decision, but many other intrinsic inefficiencies, let's be nice about it, in the Iranian economy. But when you decide to do that, you are declaring a kind of war. And I was sort of being flippant about it. It was obviously that during the time of détente, which I lived through, and the rise of Gorbachev, the notion of that we could have a Gorbachev in the context of continued escalating conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was unimaginable. What stopped that was mutually assured destruction. We don't have that with Iran. So we went the détente route, and it's hard to imagine that Gorbachev would have emerged in the absence of an effort to de-escalate U.S.-Soviet conflict. Now, suddenly, we expect de-escalation in the context of a regime-trained strategy. So, I agree with you. And here's the other downside of it. You know, I've spent my life thinking about democracy and authoritarianism. If you want to have any kind of meaningful political change in Iran, it's unlikely to happen through a collapse of the regime. That scenario is probably going to produce an outcome that will be only favorable to the most hardline forces. There has to be some sort of negotiation, which is what former President Khatami tried to engage in. There has to be some sort of negotiation. And to think that the space for that kind of meaningful de-escalation in Iran, détente within Iran, that is, it will be possible in the context of a U.S. policy of regime changes. It's just unimaginable. Now, of course, the Revolutionary Guard, they know this, and so they do not want, and they are completely against any rapprochement with the United States that's really meaningful and sustained, and they will do everything they can to stop it.
Micheline, just wait for the microphone. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. Micheline Shai, I'm a professor here. You are discussing about control escalation as a potential likelihood for war. And the evidence on the ground, and you are correct. But one could actually use the same understanding of what's happening and try to turn it around. What if we were to say that the best form of negotiation occur precisely because people feel that they are in a position of strength, and that in fact those very controlled escalations that you're referring to are just the one that are need to make any form of negotiations more credible. After all, it's not just about Rouhani and Trump. It's more than that. We know that Saudi Arabia and Iran have suffered greatly as a result of the war in Yemen and in Syria. They might not wish to make peace or have a rapprochement or any form of truce, but they might be compelled. The point I'm trying here to suggest is that rather than thinking that this will just happen because of the diplomacy that is sort of not as substantial, it may happen precisely because people are compelled to do so. The draining, the depletions of the economy as a result of those wars might be a push forward for those diplomatic efforts. Finding a solution to the Yemeni tragedy, a potential form of influence for the Iranian and the Saudi Arabian in Iran, securing the Chak Mandelbach could provide those conditions for a new truce. So circulations and potentially also diplomatic possibility for rediscussing the nuclear deal that has been presented by. So I'm trying to suggest that that's one path, but the very same path could go elsewhere. What do you think?
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting you asked this question because, and it's something I just published a paper on with the Arab Center 2 weeks ago, and that is, and the title of the paper is "Just Say No to Saudi Arabia on Yemen and Iran." I originally was just say no to Iran, but they thought I had to be more specific. I do think that one way of approaching this conflict is to focus on the Yemen situation, and to which has been attempted, but without much success. Right, all kinds of negotiations have started and failed. It's very confusing to watch the ups and downs of this. But essentially, when Trump says, "I'm waiting to hear what the Saudis want me to do," he's deferring to the Saudis. And if we're a big power, if we exercise influence, if we have deterrent or some element, we ought to be setting the agenda, and we ought to be signaling what our expectations are on particularly this issue. And I think the close relationship between MBS and our president and the White House is one thing that's getting in the way of seeing as clearly as they are now doing on the Hill in both parties about the need to step away from supporting the Saudis. The United Arab Emirates are beginning to back away for reasons of their own self-interests. In fact, the kind of alliance that they were supporting on the ground in concert with the Saudis has now completely broken down. And so there could be a propitious moment to start to think about sort of how to use this arena to begin to affect talks, and also to signal to the Saudis that, no, we're not waiting for you to tell us what you want us to do, what our next step should be. We have a strategy. We have a series of steps. This is what we want to do. That's a lot to hope for, though. But I agree with you that this is certainly one arena in which it should be explored. And we're just, right now, the positive news is in a Congress that is polarized as it is on so many issues, this is one issue that there seems to be consensus on, because Yemen is such a humanitarian disaster, is it not? And MBS's war has been a complete disaster. The Saudis have not achieved their aims, and they have forced the Houthis to escalate and be closer to Iran. The war has resulted in a fracturing of the relationship with an alliance with the Emirates. What have they achieved by this? We are being led by this insane policy, and we need to be able to back away from it. And in so doing, we can create other kinds of synergies, to use a Washington term, that might allow for a context of negotiation. But then again, this requires a strategy, and not just a kind of series of momentary decisions that it's even generous to call it tactics. That's even generous.
Okay, third question, right there, our student from Lebanon, first-year student. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. My question goes about the shift in the Saudi Arabia foreign policy. So especially when Salman is in power. So we always know that there's a tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they have different values and principles. But like my question goes, what makes Iran goes into military attack on the Saudi military oil facilities? So can we see a shift, especially when Bin Salman is in power? So there is a shift from the Saudi foreign policy toward Iran and toward the Middle East and toward a different building of relationship with the United States. So there was a huge difference in the foreign policy toward the United States when Bin Salman was in power. So how can you do an analysis for this foreign policy? That's question one. Question two goes about the Yemen war. I'm sorry. Yemen war.
Can I just deal with question one so to allow somebody else to have it?
Just
Because,
so we're all on the same
so,
footing, one question.
And question one is the topic of a good 2-day conference that I think we should start working on right away. So here's my take on it. First of all, Iran and Saudi Arabia are mirror images of one another. They're authoritarian regimes that are beholden to clerical establishments and a kind of guiding ideology. One is Shia and another is Sunni, right? The Saudis believe that Shiism is an unacceptable, ideologically, religiously speaking, theologically speaking, is not an acceptable basis to practice Islam. I mean, to put it simply. That's their belief. Doesn't mean they'll act on that belief, but that's what they believe. So, and of course, the Iranians are intensely hostile to Wahhabism, and so these two countries are at loggerheads in many respects because they represent antithetical notions of particular religious doctrines, and for strategic reasons, and because their structures are in some respects quite similar. And so I think that really makes for a very difficult relationship. Having said that, let's not forget that at different points over the last 20 or 30 years, there has been successful efforts at rapprochement. And there have been efforts, and under Rafsanjani, there was an opening to Saudi Arabia. This isn't preordained. But MBS has decided, right, to make opposition to Iran a premise of his policy for all kinds of reasons. And the emergence of the Trump White House really facilitated what he thought his ability to leverage that relationship to advance this policy. The problem that I can see from the Saudi point of view is that they think that they have some sense that by supporting the U.S. position on Iran, that somehow we'll play a game of chicken with the Iranians, and then we'll get the Iranians to negotiate. We'll come almost to the edge. We'll pull back, which, but because they don't really want war. But somehow this is going to be a successful diplomacy, and it hasn't been a successful diplomacy, has it? It hasn't succeeded, and so MBS, the marriage between the lack of strategic thinking coming from Riyadh and the lack of strategic thinking coming from Washington is just unbelievable. What a marriage made in heaven for these two countries to be locked in this kind of embrace. And that's why I think we have to get away from the embrace, at least have, a separation agreement of some kind. That's putting it too far, but we need to set the agenda. Because, and I haven't even mentioned a certain murder whose anniversary we are now marking, that was perpetrated by MBS, and so this is a time to think about this. But will it happen? I doubt it.
Okay, let's take a few more questions. 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much for being here. My question has to do with the Israeli election and whatever the final outcome is going to be of that. And how do you think that decision, whatever happens, will affect what's going on in the Middle East now? Do you have enough time?
So, the Arab political parties, which are an alliance of parties with very different agendas, right? We forget about that. The Arab alliance is an alliance. You have the communists, the Islamists, so they have a common agenda in terms of trying to figure out how to get back into Israeli politics, but beyond that, they don't have a common agenda. And they decided not to throw their weight behind with the other party, right? Kahol Levan. And so, and now Bibi's back, but he's going to be indicted. There's an echo of what's going, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Washington. We face these presidents and these prime ministers that are in serious trouble. His corruption is minuscule compared to what we're seeing, back in D.C. But in any case, but I think that the Israelis are in a very difficult position. They have basically sent messages to Hezbollah that if attacked, they are going to just flatten Lebanon. I mean, they don't want to do this, but they feel they have to say it to deter an attack. But once an attack comes, they'll follow through on it. And I don't think that's what Bibi wants to do right now. But Bibi is in a similar position to MBS and all these countries that sort of bandwagon with the Trump administration, or maybe it was the other way around, in terms of escalating the conflict with Iran, in terms of supporting the regime change strategy. The Israelis have a very serious problem, and it's not so much now in Lebanon, it's in Syria. Because the one result of the Russian-Iranian Hezbollah effort to save Assad is that the Iranians now have a much more substantial economic and military footprint in Lebanon, all the way up to the Golan. So that I'm not in any way diminishing the problem that the Israelis are facing. But what this means is that it's not obvious that there's going to be a military approach to this problem. Yet at the same time, the Israelis, as the Saudis, are supporting a game of chicken, which is extremely risky, and betting that somehow the Trump administration will demonstrate the nuance, the capacity, the timing, the ability, the talent to make this game work in favor of something that will be a kind of coercive diplomacy strategy that will get them what they want. This is not happening. So I think Bibi's in a very tight spot now, and it's, of course, the Saudis are in a tight spot. They face the Houthis, the recent attack. But for Israel, sitting there with Hezbollah armed to the teeth with missiles that can go further south than Tel Aviv, and then with having the problem along the border now with Hamas and the other factions, it's a very difficult position. But I think right now, for the time being, the saving grace is that Bibi's priority is not different from the priority of our president, and it's called "I'm going to save my skin." That's the strategy. I'm sorry if it sounds like I dislike Trump. I shouldn't. For a long time as director of a master's program, I really tried to keep out of this and tell my students that I could not take a position. But I've given up on that long time ago because the situation is just so dire. I just speak my mind because I find we're in such a moment of crisis.
So you were saying, if I understood, that the Yemen tragic fiasco is what has brought both Republicans and Democrats in Washington to question our close ties with Saudi Arabia. I think I understood that correctly.
Yeah.
And so that was my question. My comment would be, yeah, there were a whole bunch of things that the Saudis have done over 100 and some years that should have caused both parties to question our close ties in the first place.
Yeah, and you don't have to go back 100 years. You can go to 9/11, and of course, we decided for good realpolitik strategic reasons that when we faced the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we were going to back the Islamist opposition with Saudi money and Saudi help, and we made. There's always blowback from these sort of strategic decisions, and I understand that there are trade-offs, and so I recognize that this is going on a long time. But now we come to the point where initially we seem to have some sort of diplomatic strategy that would have allowed us to walk away from those kinds of very narrow trade-offs, right? That were so typical of the context of U.S.-Saudi relations, and then we threw it all away. And so it's gotten much worse. But yes, this is a government that, look at the fate of Islam in Indonesia and where that's gone. I know that's a third conference, but or look at the Balkans. Look at the effect of Saudi money in Indonesia and the Balkans in terms of affecting the nature of the practice of political Islam in those countries. It really was a game changer that we're living with now in Indonesia, because a country that was known for a vast, moderate political center of Islamic parties, not Islamists, but Islamic parties, that really could engage and negotiate with and become partners with the secular nationalist parties, has been undermined in part by the hijacking of a madrasa system by Saudi money in a country that is pivotal to the region and, of course, to U.S. interests as well. So I completely agree with you, and I think it's high time that we really think about how to reposition our relationship. High time, almost too late in that sense. Look where we're at now, because suddenly our credibility is on the line, right?
Smaller country, but you can throw Tunisia in there too.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time the last 2 years in Tunisia, and a country I know pretty well. There's money from Saudis and the UAE and sort of running around. There's all kinds of money running around. But I think that the Tunisian context has not been thrown out of whack by that money as yet. It could still happen. But the bigger point that you're making, and I think we agree on, is that the influence of the Saudis has been, in so many respects, pernicious. And yet we continue, and I understand it because, look, Saudi Arabia is our Syria. We need to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, just like the Iranians. We say, oh, the Iranians, look what they're doing in Syria. Oh my God, really? Oh, I'm absolutely shocked to see what the Iranians are doing in Syria. That's their guy. That's their regime. That's their interest. So I get it. But we've come to a point now where the way we've managed this relationship is really to do exactly what Trump is saying, and that is, we're waiting for your call to tell us what we should do. That doesn't seem to me a big power position.
Last question, here in the front.
Actually, it is an extension of what you're talking about, but I was wondering, do you think Trump has a personal interest in MBS? Is MBS providing him, because that's all he's interested in anyhow, is his own position. Do you think MBS is providing him with money? Is he beholden to MBS?
Well, you know what? Gee, it's when Washington becomes like the television show House of Cards. I hated that show for the longest time because I said, I was born and raised. This is not my town. But now suddenly it seems like the House of Cards and Washington are closely similar to one another. But I still resist the idea, and I know that the president's son-in-law has very clear business interests. And we know about all the relationships that exist between MBS and Kushner, and we know all of these things. But I don't think that's ultimately what's driving Trump. I mean, knowing what's driving Trump is not easy to say at the outset of my talk. I alluded to that. But I don't really think that's it. I do think, though, that Trump said that Sisi is his favorite dictator the other day. He despite our conflict with the leader of North Korea, he gets along with him. He feels a certain, simpatico with these kinds of leaders. And these kind of leaders understand that he's a profoundly narcissistic personality and for whom foreign and domestic policy is all about managing his narcissism. I mean it. Everything he's doing is about managing a very fragile narcissistic ego. And so when he gets together in a room with a man like MBS, who reads him so well, MBS has given him precisely the fuel he needs to walk out of that room and feel he's been sort of inflated once again. And so I think there's a lot to what is going on there in terms of that. It is shocking and dismaying to have U.S. foreign policy subordinated to the pathologies of a narcissistic personality, but I really think that's where we're at now in terms of on Ukraine and everything else, and that makes it very hard to have a rational discussion of U.S. foreign policy, because so much of what has been going on is really a function of how and what ways Trump, and on any particular day, is feeling good about his own self, and I use self in the big psychological sense. So, and I know this is reductionist and sounds simplistic and so on, but in this particular case, I think we are really at the mercy not only of a president who's sort of managing that pathology in his daily life. He gets up and he says, how can I reinflate my ego? How can I deal? How can I cope? I mean, we're all neurotic, but we're not all president of the United States, right? So this is the problem, I mean, I'm neurotic, but I just teach, at Georgetown University. I'm not president. So he's president, and then he has a Republican Party that is afraid of him, that is deathly afraid of him because they feel that his supporters will throw them out in the primaries. So we're railroading into this headlong into this crisis, and it's obvious that my perspective is that nothing is going to change unless the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue changes, and even then it's not going to be easy to sort of dig out of the hole that we put ourselves in. And I'm not optimistic that we're going to have the kind of change that I personally feel is necessary in 2020 in November. But it is very much a foreign policy that is a function of a particular kind of personality. And when, I'll close on this happy thought, when the president gets up there and says, yes, and I actually asked the Chinese to investigate Biden, what do you think of that? You know, everybody is sitting there watching going, oh my God, you know, when we thought we couldn't get to this point, we're at a new level of this stuff. And so very much the U.S., Iran, Saudi sort of triangle is sort of hostage to that personality.
Dan, these are difficult, complicated, and challenging questions, and I want to thank you for being with us today to help us unpackage them. Please join me in thanking Dan.
Thank you.